Welcome to PrivacyCast, a podcast dedicated to India's privacy journey. Today we're going to talk about DPDPA compliance for RBI regulated entities. We have with us none other than Rohan Bagai. Rohan Bagai is a partner at AZB, is a tech lawyer, has a distinguished experience in technology, fintech and digital payments and data protection and online gaming. So I know Rohan from maybe 1.5 years. I think we just realized that we know each other from 1 year.
Yeah.
In iTech dinner, right?
That's
So
correct.
that's where we met.
We met last year.
Yes, we met last year. It's been 1 year anniversary we are celebrating probably. Also recording the podcast to all the listeners. My name is Akarsh Singh. I'm the host here. I'm one of the founders at Tsaaro Consulting, a host at PrivacyCast. So we look forward to the conversation. So Rohan, talking about DPDP compliance for RBI regulated entities. So who are we talking about? Like today's discussion that we're going to have is for which type of entities? Yeah.
Thanks, Akash. It's an absolute pleasure to interact with you. I think before we get into the DPDP compliance and what it means for RBI regulated entities, I think the question you raised is a very valid one. What is the ecosystem that we are dealing with? Which entities need to do compliance and what is it that the RBI accepts from them? So RBI regulated entities have various, characteristics. Those are either licensed entities or they are unlicensed entities.
Okay.
Largely speaking, licensed entities could be banks, NBFCs, payment system operators like the wallet issuers, the gift card issuing companies.
Correct.
Like Pine Labs, etc. You could have certain players who may not directly be involved in the RBI ecosystem, but who may still be subject to the framework. For instance, the UPI apps, your Google Pays and Amazon Pays of the world. Then there are some digital lending platforms,
Okay.
which are also facilitating lending activities for the platform.
Okay.
So all in all these entities in the ecosystem are directly or indirectly subject to the RBI regulation. Ones who are licensed by the RBI are under a direct mandate from the regulator to comply with the regulations and the directive with the regulator issues from time to time. On the other hand, the entities which operate indirectly through their relationships with the other regulated entities like banks, NBFCs, the example of say a digital lending platform. The digital lending platform per se may not have a license, but they have an arrangement with the bank or NBFC based on which they are offering credit to their users. So those entities, either licensed or unlicensed, will also be subject to the RBI framework.
So a similar guideline will apply, just like a privacy thought process, controller to processor.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So either you are directly responsible or you are responsible from a contractual relationship standpoint, where the regulated entity will impose certain obligations on you to ensure that you are compliant with the overall RBI framework. But when RBI is looking at this framework, they are looking at all constituents in the ecosystem, not only the REs.
Got it. So moving on then, right? Moving on to our thought process. So we just discussed about who are we talking about today? Now, what are we talking about today? So when you talk about a DPDP compliance, it's not just DPDP compliance, right? Our work in fintechs and our detailing with NBFCs right now, what we realized is the moment we touch DPDP, we start talking about the RBI guidelines, which are specific to cyber or privacy or AI, and similar thing happens with SEBI and others. But let's focus on RBI today. So when you talk today about DPDP privacy compliance, let me just change the thought process. Privacy, what all comes into the picture for these entities? Because DPDP alone is not enough.
Yeah, so I think when we look at entities in the RBI framework, they are not simply looking at complying with the DPDP Act. RBI, as you rightly called out, being the financial services regulator, also comes out with directions in terms of how they need to manage data, cybersecurity, and various technical and organizational measures which the regulator expects on them as regulated entities. And it is simply not enough to say that because I'm compliant with DPDP Act, I'm fine. You must be, in a way, balancing the interest where you are able to comply with not only the RBI regulations but also the DPDP Act. And from that perspective, it becomes important for all entities to ensure that when they are complying with the DPDP Act, if the sectoral regulator, the RBI in this case, is prescribing certain higher standards for you to comply. For instance, for payment services entities, RBI expects you to have a hard localization requirement. What does localization mean? You need to store the payments data only in India.
And we also saw Amex cards getting blocked, if I'm correct.
Absolutely. So all that is flowing from the data localization directive of the RBI. Now, simply because the DPDP Act does not prescribe any localization doesn't mean that the payment entities can say, oh, I don't need to do anything about it.
So privacy requirements for RBI regulated entities are not that new like a DPDPA. They already had it. Their localization requirement, which is harsher requirement than any other entity. Then we also had other things like an IT Act, plus we had RBI specific guidelines, right, on how a customer to be utilized or how customers' data has to be prescribed. So would you like to talk a bit more about what was there before DPDPA also, which is going to flow again, right? It's there already.
In fact, what I want to highlight is whatever the RBI regulated entities have been doing so far by complying with the RBI regulations is only one part of the exercise. What one now needs to look at is what the DPDP Act brings in. Okay. And those are some incremental challenges. And I'll give you some examples of those. There is a certain concept of a data fiduciary under the DPDP Act. Anyone who is determining the purpose and means for processing of personal data is considered as a data fiduciary. What does it mean? Somebody who is deciding the why and the how of processing of the personal data is a fiduciary. In the banks and the fintech ecosystem, it is very often going to be the case where there are going to be multiple fiduciaries involved. We are not dealing with a scenario where there is one fiduciary and you are simply good enough to comply with the law. There will be scenarios where you may not even have, as a fiduciary, a direct relationship with the customers. In the examples I gave you of a lot of these businesses, whether they are wallet businesses, some of these businesses are B2C businesses, but then there are payment aggregator businesses, there are banks, then there are NBFCs, etc., which may already have some kind of indirect relationship with the customer. But at all times, they may not be in a position to meet the requirements of DPDP directly. And that is where the challenge comes in. If multiple fiduciaries are involved, you will need to collaborate with each other, ensure that the notice and consent requirements which are flowing from the DPDP Act are met not only by just one entity which is front-ending the customer, but all fiduciaries who are ultimately back in the chain.
Yeah, and I think if we take one quick example of that is, we are talking a lot about supply chain attacks, right? And we should also be talking about the supply chain human rights that flow through. The moment somebody puts in an access request, the moment somebody says delete my data, the delete my data is only not for the fiduciary, it also flows to everybody who has that data copy.
Absolutely.
So, it becomes a lot bigger in overall implementation process, and also it becomes a lot more tougher to give that assurance that it was actually deleted or not.
And it becomes more and more important in scenarios where there are multiple parties in the chain. There could be multiple processors, there could be multiple fiduciaries, which means that we must ensure that we have the right documentation in place.
Yeah, and in a SaaS world,
we have the data processing agreements with each of the parties,
exactly,
where roles and responsibilities of each of the parties is clearly defined. Risks associated with the data is also called out.
We were recently, I was involved in one of the leading crypto chain platforms, and we were discussing about the approach for their third-party assessments, right? Supplier chain risks. Now, after DPDP, and not just after DPDP, it's a general global concept now. So the organizations that are taking data, see, there are 100,000 vendors of organizations, right? Now, who is at higher risk? The ones which are taking data. Now, the next thought process is, what type of data? Is it IP of the company? Is it personal data of someone? If I am a healthcare organization, is it like SPII? Is it health data, biometric data? So this data points on PII becomes, somebody taking a SPI becomes the highest priority third-party risk today. Yeah. So that's where we are headed already, right? But moving on, Rohan, is how do we solve this problem, right? Let's say our listeners are listening to us and maybe somebody is in RBI regulated organization. Now, they know the problem, right? The problem is the DPDP compliance packaged with the RBI guidelines, plus IT Act, plus whatever else manages data for them, or regulates the data. So how do they solve this problem, Rohan?
So I think there are 2 or 3 ways to deal with the situation. The first is the individual who's interacting with a certain data fiduciary needs to get the right messaging through a notice provided by the front-end fiduciary.
Okay.
And the example I'm giving of this front-end fiduciary is because there are so many other fiduciaries who may be there back-end. But unless and until the front-end fiduciary provides me with the right notice, the right information, I as individual will never know who all is going to use my data and what for. Which means that then there needs to be the right contractual mechanisms between the parties to ensure that the right messaging is given to the individual, number 1. Number 2, when we're looking at consents, today when we look at the financial services sector, whether it is banks, NBFCs, fintechs, you collect the data and use it for n number of purposes.
Exactly.
Now we must, as privacy professionals, be very clear that whenever an organization is collecting data, the intent and the purpose for the use of the data is very, very clear right at the outset.
Recently, what I have started realizing is people in the board have realized it's not a privacy issue, it's a data issue. Hey, data teams are going to struggle on this, so it flows to business. So all the calls that we are having recently are either with the CIO or with the chief data officer, who are asking me that how do we not lose our data? And it's not about losing the data, as you mentioned, it's also about mapping the purpose on the data, and data can be utilized for certain reason. The abuse has to stop, right? And that's what is happening.
No, you're right. In fact, in our experience, when we are interacting with several of our clients who are sitting on legacy data, this is a huge issue with most of them, where most of them don't even know the source of the data. They don't even know where the data came from. Question of notice and consent is only secondary.
And I was in the consultation in Bombay about the DPDP Act, and this question came through. And I think one common answer that I'm hearing across from the intent of the country's ministries is that if the legacy data or any type of data, if an organization has it, it has to have a legal basis.
Correct.
It has to have, if it's customer, its consent has to be there. There's no other option.
Yeah.
So the data is not going to be there.
Yeah, unfortunately, unlike the GDPR, in India we don't have multiple grounds for processing like legitimate interest or contractual necessity, which means consent remains as the primary purpose for processing data. And that is where I think the notices will need to be formulated in a manner where we are also unbundling consents, separating the necessary purposes from the unnecessary purposes.
Exactly.
And that is why I think it's very important for professionals like us to guide the industry, that when you are doing some kind of an assessment in terms of the purpose mapping, you understand what is the purpose which is essential for your business activity, for your functions, and what is extra. And if those functions are extra or which are not necessary for you to render a service, then you must provide a separate opt-out or a separate notice for a consent to be collected, simply because you have clubbed all purposes in a privacy notice.
Yeah, it cannot be clubbed, right? And I think this is the same conversation. We just, the floor that you're on is the Tsaaro consulting floor, right?
Yeah.
The same conversation, same implementations, and consent becoming a very complex architecture, because also like one of the most beautiful challenges that, again, I have a lot of clients, right? So the thing is, I'm not speaking for them. Right? This is a very, they are okay.
Yeah.
They are doing the best. But let's talk about others. So the challenge that we are facing is people are ready to put consent frameworks on their websites, but they are still not ready to respect the consent.
Yeah.
So I want to voice it out to everybody who's RBI regulated is, I feel like when you have more regulators on the back of you, I think it's Data Protection Board is not the only board which you should be concerned about, because you have a license from RBI, a license from SEBI, or your license from IRDA. Depending on where you are, I think it should be a bit more serious. And if you're implementing consent, it has to respect people. And and I'm speaking from experience from Europe. So one of our clients was a bank in Europe, right? And I was working with their privacy team to implement consent of one of the tools. And what I realized is the DPO there was just saying no. She was right. But whole business was falling because they're not able to solve the problem and data was just getting lost. And now they are not doing so well because customer data is everything. Yeah, you have to find a way.
Well, I think the good news is, at least in our experience, a lot of these RBI regulated businesses have the awareness, have the understanding of some of these compliances because of exactly the reason we discussed earlier. They've already gone through the rigor of complying with the RBI regulations. They already have compliance frameworks in place. DPDP only becomes now one incremental law which they are looking to follow. Obviously, it requires a lot of churn in terms of revisiting your UI, UXs to see whether consents have been obtained, whether there is affirmative action or not. Because now you were in the past dealing with passive consents. Those are not going to work anymore.
Yeah.
And I think one aspect which I would also want to touch upon, which is I think very unique to the financial services space, is a scenario where multiple entities in the group typically are associated with multiple businesses. In a bank or a fintech ecosystem, you will have a tech company, you will have a financial services company, and you may have various other companies which are doing support functions. Now, in a lot of these businesses, what Akarsh we are seeing is there is a common data pool which everyone's maintaining. Everyone dips into the same pool and uses the data the way they want it. Unfortunately, that is not going to work anymore.
The data lakes.
Each data fiduciary, each business will need to have their own practices, will need to put in place their own reasonable security safeguards, will need to ensure that their contracts with data processors are safeguarding their interests.
I hear you.
So one cannot rely on one common consent which can be used by the group at large.
And I think that's something that it's a culture issue, and I think it's better to learn now than I heard this very important phrase, and I keep repeating this to my team as well. It's, either sweat in peace or bleed in war, right? So it's better to look at where are you going to bleed about this or are you going to sweat on it right now. So Rohan, I think thank you for coming over, for having this conversation in our studio.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Akarsh.
While before going, I think a lot of listeners are also learners, right? They're also learning, and while you are a leading tech lawyer in India, would you also tell a bit about your journey on how can somebody who's young, and a lot of people around us are also young, so what should they do, what should they not do in their career? Some advice for all of us, Rohan.
Yeah, so I think, to be frank, I'm not somebody who's achieved, as you call it. I think from my perspective, I am a learner, and given that we are in a phase where there are so many technology developments which are happening across the globe, whether it is data protection, whether it is AI, whether it is anything else, the fact of the matter is we are all learning on the job. I started as a corporate lawyer more than maybe 16, 17 years back. Now I'm into a certain field where I'm doing fintech, I'm doing data protection. These are areas which we never read in law school. So what is important, I think, for each one of us is to continue learning, continue reading, and continue being up to speed with the developments happening, because unless and until you are aware of your surroundings, you will never be able to basically get to a certain level where you can advise clients. And obviously, when you're an advisor, you're a lawyer, you can't simply say, I know the law, but I don't understand the business model. I think more and more our role is now adapting, and we have to now get into the basic understanding of the business models when we are advising clients. Clients do not want to simply know the law and the compliance anymore. They actually want to get into the business solutions.
Yeah, because I also feel like, I was talking to a startup and they called me up and they said, Akarsh, like, why is your fees so much? Right? This is unaffordable for us. I'm like, this is nothing, because working at your pace, if you're not doing these things, then how will you do the business? Because people, they are ready to put a chunk of money to do business for the office space, for hiring a few people,
Correct.
for buying a few softwares, what they should not forget is, they should also, because they have to do business, compliance enables them to do that. So they need to keep some money for this. This cannot be for fun. So from day one, while you are starting your business, while you are doing anything, think about doing it right. Otherwise, even when AI, the biggest challenge that we see with AI is, if we do not train on the right data set, once the DPDP goes live, then how are you going to justify that the AI model that you build is actually right?
No, absolutely.
Yeah, or you become open AI.
I think the lesson is one needs to be open to adaptation.
Yeah.
One needs to be agile. One needs to be open to reskilling and upskilling, where you need to be aware of what is going on and you must make efforts to move in that direction. You can't simply say, oh, I did this 15 years back and I can continue in my glory. Unfortunately, times have changed. You have to move with the times.
Yeah.
I think that is very important.
And 15 years back is not a good time.
No, absolutely. in these times of AI, even 15 minutes back is not a good time. So you need to be up to speed as much as you can.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, it gives you a lot of FOMO because you tend to do something.
This time at the conferences, there are like AI tools are the thing, right? Every stall that you see, every 2 meters you walk, AI tools are there. I'll automate your work, I'll make it easy, I'll make it faster, which is good. I'm looking forward to them as well. Thank you, Rohan. We have passed 15 minutes for this one. And generally, we do not do that, but this conversation went really good. We were just enjoying.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's rather than a podcast, it became a conversation.
Thank you for having me, Akarsh.
Yeah, you're most welcome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you to all the listeners for following us till the end, and have a nice day.